Hi, it's Katrina. Number 10. The Stoned Ape. The stoned ape theory is one of the most controversial theories surrounding the evolution of the human species. The theory was made popular by American scientist and mystic Terence McKenna in 1992. Terence suggested Homo erectus transitioned into the much more intelligent Homo sapiens because of an unusual dietary supplement. Terence claimed that our cognitive revolution, meaning our extremely enhanced cognitive abilities compared to our ancestors, was because of the psilocybin mushroom. When this mushroom was suddenly added to the human diet 100,000 years ago, our brains miraculously began to improve. Many believe this improvement was due to the psychoactive properties inside the mushrooms enhancing our ability to think, understand, and communicate. This theory has been largely ignored and rejected by the scientific community, but that doesn't mean it's not true. The biggest issue is the political and social stigma surrounding these natural mushrooms, which just so happen to produce a hallucinogenic trip when eaten. Terence said that when Africa began to experience desertification, humans retreated to the tropical forests. They followed cattle herds, began eating mushrooms for the first time in their history, and their brains began to evolve. He also suggested it was the psilocybin mushrooms which gave humans their first religious impulses. In other words, the mushrooms grew our brains, made us understand the world around us, and gave us imaginations to dream up our first gods. Controversial? Yes. Fun? Also yes. Number 9. The Great Sphinx's Twin. There may have once been a twin to the Great Sphinx. The monumental Sphinx, which stands guard before the Pyramid of Giza, may have once been accompanied by another, one that looked almost identical to it. The thing is that in most ancient Egyptian depictions of sphinxes, they come in pairs. For example, the earth and death deity Aker is depicted as a pair of sphinxes sitting tail to tail. Many historians agree that the Egyptians would never have built only a single sphinx, and that the Great Sphinx should have had a partner facing the opposite direction. Historians Jerry Cannon and Malcolm Hutton have suggested the lost sphinx could be buried in a mound directly beside the one that's still standing. And they aren't the only ones that think this either. On the Dream Stela, an ancient stone carved around 1400 BC during the reign of Thutmose IV, there is shown a pair of sphinxes. The Inventory Stela from 670 BC, currently exhibited at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, even mentions the sphinx being repaired after it was struck by lightning. And finally, satellite images taken by NASA appear to show a mysterious anomaly near the Great Sphinx that suggests something huge once stood beside it. The theory is that a second Sphinx once existed, but it was destroyed after being hit by lightning and never repaired. It's also believed both Sphinxes once wore metal crowns, but they were removed after they kept being hit by lightning. Cannon and Hutton believe the lightning strike likely occurred around 1000 AD, shattering the stone and ultimately destroying the second Sphinx. Number 8. The Fall of Assyria. The Assyrian Empire dominated the Near East for hundreds of years up until the 7th century BC. They ruled thanks to an unprecedented military force that brutalized its enemies and instilled fear in all those who challenged them. But when they showed their first sign of instability and weakness, they were destroyed. A coalition of rebels appeared, other lesser kingdoms rose up, and the people of Mesopotamia banded together to bring down the Assyrian Empire. It was one of the largest wars ever fought on the planet, lasting over 20 years. When war was finished, the Assyrian Empire was wiped out. But who were the Assyrians? They were an ancient group of people who appeared at the dawn of civilization in the 21st century BC in what is now Iraq. According to historians, they worshipped a pantheon of deities known as the Anunnaki. These gods were considered descendants of heavenly beings who arrived on Earth and created humans. The primary function of the Anunnaki was to dictate the fate of humanity. According to some, like famous British conspiracy theorist David Icke, the Anunnaki were more than just gods. David and others like him believe the Anunnaki were real reptilian beings who came down from space to rule over the early tribes of humans. They were our reptilian overlords and the real rulers of ancient Assyria. But after Assyria was destroyed, the reptilian overlords lost a lot of their power. They then had to adapt, moving into the shadows and ruling over humanity in secret, which some theorize they have been doing for the past 4,000 years. Number 7. Merlin's Magic. Was the famous wizard Merlin truly an ancient magician, or was he just a character in a fairy tale? Or, as a third option, was the famous Merlin from the Arthurian legends a wise tutor who went down in history as a mythological spellweaver? According to the legends, Merlin was imbued with many magical powers, such as shape-shifting. The first mention of Merlin is in The History of Kings of Britain, written in 1136 as a work of non-fiction. The book was supposed to be a record of the true history of the English kings. In this book, Merlin is described as the son of the devil and a servant of God. From his very beginnings, Merlin was a source of great mystery, but some historians theorize his character was based on multiple historical figures. In 1136, when the book was written, these historical figures would have been well known to most people, although largely forgotten today. These figures include the prophet Myrddin Wyllt and the brutal war leader Ambrosius Aurelianus. Merlin also prophesied that Arthur would become king of the Britons. It's impossible to say which theory is correct. After all, they're just theories. Merlin was either inspired by a real prophet who spoke of a coming king, or he was a real wise man who lived 1,000 years ago and assisted some other king in matters of magic and astronomy. Number 6. The Wendigo. The Wendigo is an ancient nightmare spoken of in whispers by the First Nations people of the Plains. The Wendigo is an insatiable monster with a hunger for human meat. According to the legend, the Wendigo was once a hunter, but he became lost on a scary winter night. His hunger drove him to commit unspeakable acts, and he slowly transformed into a crazed beast. Ever since, he has been roaming the forest in search of humans to eat. His story is horrifying and made even scarier by the fact that it might have been inspired by something that really exists. The myth of the Wendigo likely comes from the Algonquian Native Americans, but depending on who you ask, the details change. They didn't exactly write their stories down, and so tales of the Wendigo have been passed from generation to generation verbally. The theory some experts have is that the Wendigo is, or was, a relative of Bigfoot. That's right, the famous North American beast that so many have seen, but none have ever properly photographed. Sightings of both the Wendigo and Bigfoot have been made in Canada and cold northern states like Minnesota. All the way into the 20th century, Algonquian tribes blamed unsolved disappearances on attacks perpetrated by the Wendigo. And if Bigfoot can exist, why not a bloodthirsty cousin? Some believe Bigfoot and the Wendigo are distant relations, creatures left behind from prehistory. What do you think? Is the Wendigo real? And if so, is he related to Bigfoot? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to hit that subscribe button while you're at it. Number 5. The Reincarnation of the Temple Priestess. Seti, born with the name Dorothy Louise Eady in 1904, was one of the most peculiar figures of modern archaeology. She was an antiques caretaker, an Egyptologist, and the keeper of the Abydos Temple of Seti I. But these days, she is mostly famous for the bizarre theory she had about herself. Dorothy, who worked for the Department of Egyptian Antiquities, believed she was the incarnation of a priestess from ancient Egypt. She was behind considerable historical research in Egypt, but also believed her previous life was that of a temple priestess. The strange belief began around 1931 when she moved to Egypt. She married a man and lived in Cairo, then began having nighttime visits from an apparition of Hor-Ra, an extremely obscure deity. According to Dorothy, Hor-Ra explained through these nightly visits her entire life as a young woman in Egypt between 1290 and 1279 BC. She was supposedly a virgin priestess who was visited by Seti I, the king, and impregnated. Dorothy died at the age of 77 in 1981. She most certainly made some major contributions to Egyptian archaeology, but whether she truly was a reincarnation of the mysterious priestess who gave birth to the child of a king, nobody can really say. Number 4. The Aztec Death. 500 years later, and scientists believe they finally have a realistic theory for what killed the Aztecs. And no, it wasn't just Spanish colonialism. On top of that, the truth is that in 1545, disaster struck the Aztec in the form of a sickness. Within just 5 years, 15 million people were killed by an epidemic the Aztec named Cocolitzli. That was roughly 80% of their population. It was this sickness that made the Aztec people so easy for the Spanish to conquer and subjugate. With their population sick and dying, they could barely defend themselves. The sickness itself was one of the worst humans ever contended with. First came a fever, then a headache, then the victim would bleed from their eyes, mouth, and nose. The only good thing was that death would normally come within just 3 days after the first fever. The mystery is that no one has ever known what caused it. Big suspects are smallpox or influenza, but just recently, scientists found DNA evidence that it was an enteric fever, something similar to typhoid. Scientists found the evidence by looking at the teeth of Aztec victims. Researchers from the University of Tübingen in Germany were behind the discovery. They say there are no more theories, and that the enteric fever was definitely behind the sickness. It was almost as bad as the Black Death in Europe 200 years earlier. As for what caused this sickness, researchers believe it was likely domesticated animals brought by the Spanish that infected food and water in Mexico and poisoned the Aztec. Number 3. The Message from Mars. In 1908, a message from Mars found its way to a rural community on an island in British Columbia, Canada. 14-year-old Willie McKinnon was working on his father's property in Cowichan Valley when a meteor fell through the atmosphere and hit the ground 8 feet from where he was standing. The meteor was round as a marble, and its surface was etched with symbols that looked a lot like Egyptian hieroglyphics. The shocking story was published on the front page of a local news article on September 5, 1908. Willie then spent the rest of his life trying to decipher the mysterious message from Mars. At least that's according to the legend. The sad fact is that we have no idea where this miraculous stone is today, and it was never officially studied by any scientists. Some believe the meteor was a message from someone out in the universe, while others say it was nothing but a silly hoax from over 100 years ago. But if this space rock truly did have hieroglyphics on it, that would change everything we know about human society. It would mean the Egyptians may have copied their ancient system of writing from beings who brought it with them to this planet. Number 2. Atomic Theory. There may have been an Indian mystic who lived 2,600 years ago who came up with the atomic theory. Not necessarily the atomic theory of the bomb, but the idea that atoms exist. If correct, it would mean Indian philosopher Acharya Kanad discovered the atomic world 26 centuries before we did. Acharya was born in 600 BC in Gujarat, India. His origin story says that he was on a pilgrimage when he saw thousands of other pilgrims throwing flowers and grains of rice in the street in front of a temple. He suddenly became fascinated by these tiny grains and spent the next hours gathering them up in the street. It was as he picked up the grains of rice that he realized the world and all matter must be made of similar tiny pieces. Just like how countless grains of rice can make a meal, countless tiny particles must make up a person. It was as he broke bread into small fragments that he got the idea for the atom. Acharya realized that eventually he could break the pieces of bread into no smaller fragments. He realized there must be an indivisible piece of matter that cannot be divided at all, and called it Anu. This theory, this idea about the smallest possible piece, wouldn't be confirmed by scientists until 1800, and that was when John Dalton developed modern atomic theory. Number 1. The development of language. There is not one scientist alive who can say exactly how language began. The written word began long after the first human uttered a sound, and so there isn't exactly evidence to show how it happened. It's become such a fruitless endeavor that many of the original theories are now seen as jokes in the scientific community. For example, there is the bow wow theory. This theory suggests that human speech began when people started mimicking sounds in nature. For example, mimicking the bow wow of a dog, the moo of a cow, or the tweeting of birds. Most scientists think that isn't the case, though. Then there is the poo-poo theory. This one says that humans created their first words by copying vocal responses to things like pain and emotion. For example, when you stub your toe and cry out. The idea is that humans would have heard these automatic vocal responses, then added their own sounds and noises onto them until they had created language. How do you think humans develop language? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching! Remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and come back soon for more awesome videos. Bye!